All right. Hello, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon for some of you, and welcome to our follow-up on SOAR 2020 emissions model webinar. I am Sam Pornazeri, Chief of the Mobile Source Analysis Branch at the California Air Resources Board. My team at CARB is responsible for development of tools and modeling platforms to estimate emissions from all mobile sources operating in California, from cars and trucks all the way to off-road equipment such as rail, construction, and lawn and garden equipment. Today, I'm here with my off-road gasoline emissions inventory team. David Cho, manager of the off-road gasoline inventory, along with our inventory lead staff, Walter Wong, Debbie Futaba, and Kaishan Jang. Also with us are our small off-road engine regulatory team, Christopher Dilbeck, manager of the testing and certification section, and Dorothy Fibiger, our lead regulatory staff, who will help us with any regulatory-related questions. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. We will try to make the video available on our mobile source emissions inventory website. To start with, CARB staff held a webinar on Wednesday, March 25th, last Wednesday, where staff discussed the development of the SOAR 2020 model. At the webinar, staff summarized the SOAR activity and population survey recently conducted by the Cal State Fullerton. Staff also provided an overview of the SOAR population growth assumptions and the development of emission factors. Unfortunately, due to some of the technical issues that interrupted the second half of the March 25th workshop, we decided to have a follow-up webinar to ensure we address any remaining questions you might have about the SOAR 2020 emissions model that were not addressed during last week's webinar. Before going through the questions from the audience, I would like to provide a brief overview of the materials posted on our website, which include a copy of the webinar presentation, a video recording of the webinar proceedings, and a synopsis of the questions received from the stakeholder and CARB staff responses to them on March 25th. With that, you can see, you can basically go to our website listed over here at arb.ca.gov, or you can search, Google search mobile source emission inventory at CARB, and you will be brought to a page at CARB. You can click on the meetings and workshops, and this is where the materials are posted. We have the updated slides from March 25th workshop, which may make some updates due to some of the typos. We have the original slides on March 25th for comparison. We have a video from the proceedings, from the webinar proceedings from the March 25th. And also we have responses to questions received through the webinar as well as through email as of last Friday. So please feel free, again, feel free to send us your comments and suggestions by April 24, 2020, along with any supporting data you feel can help us to improve our emissions inventory. We are expecting to receive questions and comments from you, as well as any supporting data you have. And with that, here we get to the last slide, which provides the contact information for the lead staff on both inventory and regulatory managers overseeing the program. And my contact information is also provided at the bottom. So before we get to the questions, I want to give you an overview of the questions, the major questions we've received over the last week, and provide you with some of the responses to them. Although you can find the responses also on our website under a document called Public Workshop Q&A document, which was posted on 3/27/2020. So during our March 25th workshop webinar and shortly after that, we've received almost 57 questions, of which you can find the answers on the Q&A document posted on our website. Also earlier this week, we met with a representative from the Outdoor Power Equipment Institute, OPEI, and some of its members, where we discussed a significant number of specific questions raised by its industry members regarding content of the PowerPoint we presented at the March 25th webinar workshop. We appreciate their comments and are willing to meet with any interested parties to discuss their particular concerns. Here, I would like to go through some of the questions we received during our March 25th workshop, and hopefully that might answer some of the questions you have today. So the first question that was asked by multiple folks was that, is CARB willing to share the new model or only the underlying data? Will the model be available for evaluation before April 24th? The answer to that is we can definitely share with you the underlying data, including the input files as well as the output files that were used to generate the emissions estimate presented on March 25th webinar workshop. I want to emphasize that the model is still preliminary and we're working to fine-tune the assumptions as well as the code. In case the model input does not provide you with necessary information, we can work together and walk you through the codes and the methodology that we employed to estimate population activity and emissions from this category. The second question was regarding the survey. Are the questions of the survey or even the survey, the full report for the survey available? So the answer is yes. The question along with the final report are available to review. You can contact Dorothy Fibiger, the second person on the left from the top, the second, Dorothy Fibiger at dorothy.fibiger@arb.ca.gov. And we can share the final survey report, which includes all survey questions. There were questions regarding many different equipment types, including manual equipment such as broom and rakes too. The executive summary and the abstract of the report can be found at CARB's Small Off-Road Engine website. The third question that were asked by a couple of people was, is there a full list of proposed emission factor available? Yes, you can either email Walter Wong or David Cho, and we should be able to provide you with the complete list of the proposed emission factors for the preliminary estimates that were presented in the workshop. Please note that the analysis shown in the workshop was preliminary and is subject to change. In terms of the technical questions we've received, there were a couple of questions that I'm going to just read some of the answers. And again, you can find the answers on the Q&A document. There was a question about the exhaust deterioration assumptions in the model. The question was, on slide 24, it appears the deterioration rate is based solely off the emission standards and not data. Did ARB consider deterioration rate from certification data? Also, did CARB assume all deterioration rate are positive from 0 hour to the standard? Any negative deterioration rates? Finally, what does CARB have to extrapolate the DR linearly beyond the useful life? So the answer to this question is that the DR, or the deterioration rate, which is an increase in emissions as the equipment age, presented in slide 24, is under the assumption that emissions from small off-road engines are typically lower than certification standard when they're brand new. And they hit the emission standards when they pass when they hit their respective durability hours and pass that hours. Please note that emission deterioration in mobile source emission inventory is reflective of both natural degradation of engine as well as an increase in the emission due to the engine malmaintenance and malfunctioning emission control system. So this is a pretty critical point because inventories are trying to be reflective of real-world emissions from the equipment. So in the real-world, equipment may not be maintained well, and some of them may fail in terms of after-treatment systems or in terms of emission control units or the engine components, and those sometimes can result in higher emissions. I mean, usually in inventory world, they say small number of equipment are responsible for majority of the emissions. So the inventory, therefore, we assume that emission deterioration for emissions inventory are typically higher than the emission deterioration rates provided by the manufacturer during the certification testing. Since those deterioration rates do not account for the increase as a result of malmaintenance. According to the 2018 Cal State Fullerton survey data, only half of the professional users properly maintain their equipment according to manufacturer recommended maintenance schedule. This number for residential users is less than 40%. Currently, we're not assuming any negative deterioration. In the absence of any available data on emission deterioration beyond the certification, this is the best assumption we can make at this point. However, we definitely encourage you and all stakeholders to share with us any real-world emission information you might have that can further improve our assumptions. There was a question later on the same deterioration rate for the evaporative emissions and the inclusion or exclusion of liquid leakers in the model. So the question was, it's not clear whether the liquid leakers are considered in the model or not, and why the model is assuming two deterioration rates for the evaporative emissions for lawnmowers such as DR1 and DR2. So we wanted to clarify that the first bullet on slide 29 does not indicate there's no data to support leakage. It just indicates that due to the lack of available data, the model does not explicitly account for liquid leakers. However, as mentioned in the 2003 technical memo titled Addition of Evaporative Emissions for Small Off-Road Engines, the emissions estimates at 14 years are the average of two lawnmowers that was tested at the time, one of which was found to have a liquid leak. Because the deterioration rate beyond year 7 was highly influenced by the emission of this liquid leaker, staff surveyed a number of lawnmower repair shops and requested manufacturers' input to determine how often these type of problems occur. Although it was confirmed at the time that lawnmowers with liquid leaks are not uncommon, it was not possible to determine the incidence with accuracy. Staff found no compelling reason to exclude that liquid leaker from the analysis. Also, it is worthwhile to mention that in September 2015, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission published a study titled Study of Fuel Leaks Associated with Outdoor Ground-Supported Gasoline-Powered Equipment, which basically described gasoline fuel leakages from outdoor ground-supported equipment, including lawnmowers and generators that pose a fire hazard. This report is publicly available. It can be found on the Cpsc website. The sources of leak was determined to be fuel tank, hoses, fuel filters, fuel caps, and grommets. Beyond that, we have some test data, in-house test data from testing of compressors, which were showing that some of the brand new compressors which we tested, some of them were having liquid leaks. These are the some of the evidences were showing that there are some liquid leaks happening in the small off-road engines, and that's why it's necessary for us to account for the deterioration rates. However, due to the lack of available evaporative emission data across different ages and usages of equipment, we decided to rely on the deterioration rate extracted from the offer 2007 as illustrated in slide 29. We definitely encourage you to share with us any information or emission data you have on liquid leakers, including information such as the prevalence of occurrence, and we will definitely consider using them to update the evaporative emission rates for SOAR 2020 model. Also, I should mention that currently the model assumes no emission deterioration for light commercial equipment. Although we have identified leaking compressors within our in-house evaporative emission testing, we also encourage that to get your inputs and everyone's inputs on light commercial equipment as well. The last question that we wanted to also discuss is the question regarding the growth rates. So as was presented on slide 36 of the workshop webinar slide, we were showing for lawnmowers and pressure washer, we're assuming a 0.5% year-over-year growth in their sales and 0.7% for generators. There was a question received from the Outdoor Power Equipment Institute, OPEI, in which states that in 2018, OPEI 50-state shipment data shows walk-behind motor gasoline sales were dropped by 6.5%. Gasoline handheld blowers were dropped by 7.4%. Gas trimmers and brush cutters were dropped by 6.6%. Gas chainsaws were dropped by 5.5%. And most have successive years of negative growth now. Why is California different? So the answer to that question is we do not think that sales in California are significantly different than the rest of the country. And we do acknowledge that year-over-year growth can change from one year to another. For example, according to production volume data reported to us through the exhaust certification, between 2013 and 2014, there has been a drop in sales in California, which was picked up again in 2015. So while 1 year may show a significant drop in sales, the next year may show a significant increase. The purpose of this exercise or this modeling exercise is to determine the long-term, and I repeat again, long-term organic growth of gasoline and electric equipment for both lawn and garden as well as light commercial categories. According to the annual production volume of gasoline small offroad engines between 2002 and 2018 provided by the manufacturers, starting in 2010, there has been a steady growth in the national market, with California closely following that trend. Therefore, based on the data we currently have, which is the annual production volume from both exhaust and evaporative certifications, we do think that assuming 0% growth for handheld equipment and 0.5% growth for lawnmower or ground-supported equipment is a reasonable assumption. We have also looked into the independent market research, such as the industry study number 3674 for power lawn and garden equipment, published by the Fredonia Group on September 2018. This study presents historical demand data in 2007, 2012, and 2017, and forecasts for 2022 by power sources such as internal combustion engine, corded electric, and battery powered, as well as the products such as lawnmowers, turf and garden ground mowers, trimmers and edgers, and garden tractors. The report indicates that the U.S. demand in units of $1 million for lawnmowers, both riding and walk behind, will have an annual average compound growth rate of 3.3% for internal combustion engine powered and 6.1% for electric powered. According to the same study, the lawnmower demand in terms of number of units will have an annual compound growth rate of 1.8% between 2017 and 2022. Please note that the report is available for purchase through Fredonia Group. It needs to be noted that the SOAR 2020 model presented on March 25th webinar workshop is assuming 0.5% year-over-year growth for lawnmower and pressure washer and 0.7% for generators. Despite these available information, we still think having historical data on the shipment by equipment type will be very critical for us to assess some of these assumptions. We do encourage the industry to share with us the 50-state shipments as well as California shipment if it's available for the past 10 years for both electric and gasoline equipment, as it helps us to corroborate data we received through EVAP certification program and also other data sources that we have looked at, such as the independent market research, to have a better long-term forecast for the sales of the equipment. So before starting the Q&A session, I would like to again apologize for any technical issue that may arise during this webinar, just like last week. As we are practicing social distancing, we're all working remotely, and we might experience some connectivity issues during the presentation. So I apologize in advance. For questions and comments, you can simply type your questions through the webinar question box located on the GoToWebinar dashboard. We'll go through the questions as we receive them, and we'll answer them accordingly. In case there's a follow-up question or you would like to further discuss your questions, you can contact us through email, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. And with that, we can start answering some of your questions. So we have received a question from Jamie Banks. Would you please review the deterioration data? Do these account for how old the pieces of equipment are? Is there any sensitivity analysis that account for maintenance practices? For example, well-maintained to poorly maintained. So definitely we can review that, Jamie, with you. So in terms of the deterioration data for evaporative emissions, this was based on the data we had back in 2003. We can share with you the memo that I just talked about which described that how the deterioration rate, the evaporative emission deterioration rate for lawnmowers were determined. But for the exhaust deterioration, we can also walk you through our methodology and also the assumptions we're making at this point. So we are planning to do some sensitivity analysis on the deterioration rates for both EVAP as well as exhaust to determine the impact of emission deterioration on the overall emission estimates. So those are, this is a really good comments, and I really appreciate it. We're definitely planning to go through those. And if you need more information on those reports and assumptions we have made, we can definitely set aside a meeting with you to go through that. So Sam Peterson had a question still. So the question is still just seeing the contact page. Should the slides be moving? Well, in this, this is a follow-up webinar, as I mentioned. We're not planning to go over all of the slides again that we presented last week. But in case you're interested in the slides, you can go to our web page and you can click on the workshop presentation, on the updated slides, and you can find all of the slides over there. We can definitely share with you the slides or the link to the workshop presentation. It should be on the. It should be also available on the Gov delivery notice that you might have received. So there's a question on slide 10. So maybe it's better for us to pull up the slides. We can take a look at them. On slide 10, I assume you're talking, so there's a question from Patrick Lunhockey. On slide 10, why are utility cars and vehicles not included? I'm going to assign this question to David Cho, and he should be able to respond. We do have a separate inventory for utility vehicles. It's called recreational vehicle, and those vehicles are included in that inventory. David, do you want to provide more information on that?
I think Sammy already answered the question. We do have a recreation vehicle model, RV 2018. So in that model, we handles all the recreation vehicles, including those utility vehicles as well. So this group of vehicles are handled in a separate model.
Okay. There's a question from Tom Darlington. Are you going to put the input and output files on the SOAR website? How will you make those available? Tom, so this was also a request we also got from a couple of other stakeholders. So we did package the input files as well as the output files in a zip file. The size of the file is about 160 megabytes. And we are now submitting that to our PRA coordinator. You can contact us through either you can email me or David or Walter. We'll send this request to our PRA coordinator, and they will send you the link to download the data. So unfortunately, we cannot email it to you, but we can. But there's a link which you can simply download it, and it has instructions. The email that you come from our PRA coordinator will have the instructions on what files are contained for input files as well as the output files. And if you need any further information on how those numbers are generated, we can definitely set aside a meeting with you to walk you through those files and how the numbers are generated. Hopefully that answers your question. There's a question from Stephen Brink. Do you have a replacement schedule for each of the different categories of equipment? I'm particularly interested in chainsaws. I'm going to assign this question to Walter Wong, and I guess this question is about survival rates. Maybe Walter, do you want to give a quick overview of the replacement schedule or the survival curves that we're assuming for each equipment and how they were generated.
Yeah, we can provide you the survival curve for a chainsaw, and we can walk you through the steps how we put it together. We started with getting age distribution from the 2001 survey, and then we tried to use the year over year as a surrogate, and then we try to come up with a survival curve for those.
Thanks, Walter. So Stephen, definitely reach out to us and we should be able to provide you with those information. And for some of you that I'm responding to your questions, if you're getting a blank response in your webinar chat, we're just trying to mark the questions that are answered so that we can go through the questions one by one. Okay, there's a question from Hideharu Takimoto. The question is, why don't you split evap and liquid leakage in the model? Combining both makes real issues, challenges, mixed and vague. That's an interesting question, and that's an interesting comment. I think it would be helpful for us to maybe think about, if there is a possibility to separate the issues with respect to mail maintenance, the issues, or the emission increase with respect to liquid leak versus like tear and wear of the equipment. We can think about it. We'll definitely consider that and think about it, and we can definitely get back to you. Overall, for the liquid leaks, again, going back to the responses we gave earlier on, I think the prevalence and the emissions of them are important, so hopefully we can give you more information on that. But that's an interesting question. We'll definitely consider that. So there's another question from Jamie Banks. And maybe I can ask either Christopher or Dorothy to respond to that. Maybe they have a better handle on that. And if Christopher, if not, you can, we should be able to provide some information. So the question, I will read it. This is a question that does not bear off the model, but wanted to ask, given evidence suggesting high levels of PM2.5 carcinogens from handheld gas, lawn, and garden tools in close proximity to use, is there anyone at CARB or other organization researching this?
Okay, this is Christopher Dilbeck. Jamie, we have been looking into exposure to operators of equipment from the engine emissions. So some of our work was summarized in a document we posted on our website in October 2018 that indicated elevated cancer risk for operators of several equipment types, with the highest levels coming from chainsaws and leaf blowers. We think, partially due to the emissions of the engine, but also the position of the equipment relative to the operator's breathing zone, with a chainsaw being operated in front of the person using it. That report is, the summary is on our website, and we're looking into continuing that work.
Thanks, Christopher. So there's a question from Shogo Matsuki. Shogo asked the question, on the latest presentation, is it possible to point out what has been updated from 325 to 330? it seems like that there were updates in the inventory data, light commercial, and the SOAR 2020 graph changed a little. That is correct, Shogo. So as I said, there were some last-minute changes on the March 25th workshop with respect to compressor activity, which made the compressor activity lower, which was presented on the workshop slide, but the emission numbers, unfortunately, were not updated at the time. So we updated those emission numbers, which resulted in a reduction in light commercial emissions by a couple of tons on the SOAR 2020 model. So that is correct. We also received some comments from stakeholders on some of the slides. Some of the slides were vague or were misrepresented, and we made some caveats on some of the slides to make sure it's providing the right information. There is another question. What is the latest schedule of SOAR emission regulatory work? For example, when is the next workshop and the target CARB board meeting? Christopher, do you want to talk about the regulatory workshop and regulatory calendar?
Sure. So we are planning to hold a workshop on a preliminary draft regulatory proposal in May, and we're planning to bring our proposal to our board in November of this year. So we'll announce a workshop a few weeks in advance when we have a firm date.
Thanks, Christopher. There is another question from Hideharu Takimoto. Is it reasonable to count liquid leakage from air quality point of view? However, from product design and production point of view, leakage and evap are completely different. If liquid leakage is still an issue, why don't you set a leakage standard, not simply make evap standard stringent? Christopher, do you want to take this question on, since this is regulatory related?
Okay, give me a second. I just saw it pop up.
Sure.
So looking at leakage, we are thinking about ways to address leakage. Some of the concepts we're considering were discussed in a rulemaking workshop in September 2019. And we're also looking into updates to the ANSI OPEI B71.10 2018 fuel system standard, and are interested to talk to OPEI as well about that, to see how that standard has changed versus the 2013 version, because some of the one portion of that procedure that we incorporated in the 2016 evaporative emission regulations amendments was a fuel line tensile test, which is designed to prevent fuel lines from being pulled off. And one issue in particular that I think would be useful to discuss is similar requirements for handheld engines, because we're not sure right now what requirements there are for the handheld side.
Thanks, Christopher. Okay, this was all the written questions so far we received. Greg Knott sent the question. Just a reminder, I have my hand up. I have several questions and would like a dialogue, please. Sure, Greg. I will unmute you, and then we can get back. I also received another written question So Ryan Kosher is also asking, how can I ask questions by audio? I will ask one, but I think it's perhaps too complicated here. So Ryan, you may raise your hand on the webinar, and we can definitely provide you with some time to talk. So I will unmute Greg Knott. Greg Knott, you're on. You want to ask your questions?
Can you hear me okay, Sam?
Yes, I can hear you.
A couple things that you already addressed, but I want to double check on. I had submitted a request for the model input and output files last Wednesday, immediately following the presentation. You mentioned I can now reach out to somebody else, the coordinator, or have you already done that on my behalf? I have not yet seen a link.
We have submitted, so we have packaged it and reviewed the package and submitted it to our PRA coordinator. It should come to you fairly soon. We were hoping it's gonna get to you this morning, but hopefully by the end of the day you should receive it. If not, please reach out to me again, and we should be able to get that to you. So the package is ready. I know you mentioned thank you very much for providing us with the Dropbox, but we decided to just put it as a download link in a zip file, which is password protected, but the password is provided to you via our PRA coordinator. So they're going to reach out to you pretty soon with the link to both output files, which includes 2018 and 2031 by model year at the glorious details, as well as all the inputs for all the 8 categories, and by category, I mean lawn and garden, like commercial, industrial, airport, etc.
Okay. Yeah, appreciate that. I think my concern is now we're 8 business days removed from the first presentation, and that April 20th deadline isn't moving. So it's an incredible lift for us to evaluate 9 months worth of inventory modeling work on your staff's, your good staff's work, and then as well as data that I'm still waiting for on the survey, raw data behind that supports this inventory work, which I haven't seen yet. And to do that in whatever we're talking about now, like 10 or 12 business days, it's going to be a challenge.
I understand, and we can I can definitely take this back and discuss it with my management.
Okay, thank you. I did know, Christopher, I know when we talked this week, you said you were surprised to hear I hadn't received the raw data from the survey yet that I had requested, I think, in January. I still haven't seen anything from anybody on that this week. Have you taken a look at that?
Yeah, we were told it was sent out, so I don't know if something was mailed, but we'll check if it was emailed, because we were told it was sent out. Okay,
thank you. Appreciate that. Next question is with regards to the DRs and the discussion about the malmaintenance and the recognition of both compliance and real world with establishing DRs and malmaintenance. What work, Sam, did your team conduct as you extrapolated these DRs out with this assumption? Was there FMEAs conducted? What are the failure modes for this type of equipment that result in these types of DRs?
So as I mentioned, right now we're just employing the same methodology, the same established methodology that is employed by the OFR 2007 in terms of the exhaust emission deterioration. And as mentioned, we're starting at a much lower rate, and then certification standards and keeping at the standards. We haven't got a lot of data. There's not a lot of available data on how emissions, from the in-use perspective, the real-world emissions due to at the in-use as these equipment ages. So that was the best available assumptions we have made at the time for exhaust emission factors increasing over time as a result of the both tear and wear as well as the malmaintenance. But we can definitely, over the next 6 months, we're going to definitely look more closely into this issue as you raised during the in one of your questions and also by others. We're definitely going to have a closer look into this and try to see if there are other data sources that we can rely on to better estimate deterioration rates for the exhaust emissions.
So, okay, thanks, Sam. So one thing you mentioned was that it was the same methodology as was used in off-road 2007. So the extrapolation was the same, but I know off-road 2007 did have negative DRs, and you said that you don't have negative DRs here. So I guess I don't think the methodology is the same. In fact, I know it's quite different because there was no difference by particular life category, right? So if you had a chainsaw, it had the same 0 hour and the same DR, regardless of a 50-hour chainsaw or a 300-hour chainsaw. And as a result, the extrapolation out to 300 hours for that type of engine and chainsaw was roughly, if I want to do some rough extrapolations, about 3 times what the certification limit would have been. So I don't think that that's a correct statement that it's the same methodology as off-road, at least the interpretation that I got from today. Again, in part because there's negative DRs in there, and in part because of some of the limits of current off-road. So do you, kind of reflecting back on that, could we have a discussion about what your understandings are of the failure mode analyses due to maintenance? Does certainly your staff, these are the assumptions that are being drawn, have some general things we could just talk about so I can get a little better idea what you think? What malmaintenance, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to your staff that modeled this? Can we look at a couple examples and talk about that?
Can you elaborate what you mean by, so let me first answer your first question. Your first question was about the methodology. So when we say methodology, we're just talking about the framework, not necessarily exact same numbers. And we try to be consistent with the method that is not only on the lawn and garden, but also some of the other categories where we assume some level of deterioration or sometimes no deterioration assumptions. So depending on different sectors. That's why in this current version, we're not assuming any negative deterioration. I have to go back and check on the offer 2007 and check with my staff on the negative deterioration that we're assumed over there, and we can definitely get back to you on that. In terms of the problem you mentioned regarding the malmaintenance, the information we have as of this point are based on the survey on how people are maintaining their equipment. So there's not a lot of maintenance. From the other inventories, not necessarily not this model, from the other emission inventory model, not necessarily this model, we have seen that the maintenance issue can result in very high emissions on certain equipment because the equipment is not, it might have a leakage or might have some hoses are not fitted correctly. So, and as they age, they start leaking. This is not necessarily going to be a compliance issue, but it's more on the maintenance issue and end users. So those are the type of information we have. Again, as I mentioned during our responses, as of this point, for the deterioration rate and in-use emissions increase, we are relying on, for EVAP, we're relying on offer 2007, which, as you know, and as I read in the 2003 memo, we have indicated we have tested 2 lawnmowers, of which one of them were liquid leaking. For compressors, the new data we have is showing there are 2 out of 10 compressors that are leaking, and surprisingly, all of those 10 were brand new compressors. So there are evidences, but unfortunately, there are lack of data, available data over there. But because there are evidences, we cannot just ignore the deterioration rate. And I definitely encourage you and your members to share with us if there are informations about deterioration and the in-use emissions associated with these equipment, so we can take a look and then adjust accordingly.
So I think I heard some good examples of the EVAP stuff. I guess I didn't hear any examples of deterioration of or malmaintenance of exhaust side and how that correlates. So I'm interested to see the analysis.
We can definitely look into that. That's a good comment, Greg. We can definitely look into that and get back to you and look into the data set we have or we have collected so far, try to see if there are data that can use to adjust this.
Okay. All right. One thing you talked about was the adjusting the model for real world versus compliance. On the other hand, we looked at, or part of the data set includes, you just mentioned, 2 0-hour compressors that leaked. I'm curious what your data suggests of the likelihood of a consumer keeping a brand new several $100 or several $1,000 piece of equipment that leaks from 0 hours. What data suggests that doesn't get fixed?
That's a good question. Maybe Christopher, do you want to talk a little bit about those leaking compressors and how they were procured, or whether were they randomly procured? Were there visible leaks, or were they just very small leaks that were not visible? Because we know, for example, because we have a lot of data on the on-road mobile sources, there are sometimes liquid leakers, cars that are liquid leaking, and consumers or drivers are still keeping them. And sometimes the leaks are so small and they're not visible. And sometimes there are visible leaks, or you can at least smell it. So.
Yeah. So, in the past several years between validation study work and compliance testing work, we've observed a number of units leaking, and the severity has ranged. So some units have shown, kind of let's say, weeping of fuel from the fuel tank. So it's hard to tell, how fast it's leaking. Some people might not notice. In the case of the 2 compressors in the recent compliance test, one was leaking liquid quickly out of the seam of the fuel tank. So it's reasonable to assume that somebody might return that unit, or they might try to repair the leak themselves if they didn't feel like taking it back to the store or it was inconvenient. The other unit had seemingly a less severe leak, where you could detect a high concentration of hydrocarbons with a sniffer around the fuel tank, but it wasn't pouring liquid out of the side. So it still had a very severe emission rate of 15 grams per day when we tested it. So I think, to answer your question, Greg, some people might return units with severe leaks. Others might try to repair it or live with it, maybe drain the fuel afterwards. And then with less severe leaks.
That's absolutely conjecture, though, right?
Sure. People would take different approaches, is what I'm saying. We purchased these units at stores. They had the emission rates they had, and so that's what we're reporting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I want to make sure there's a difference in this, and Sam drove this home on our call Monday, that there's a difference between the real world and, at least from a modeling standpoint and from compliance. I completely see where you're at from a compliance perspective, and certainly wouldn't argue that. I think the reality is, if something's leaking, and it's conjecture on my behalf too right now, that somebody would likely take it back, ask for warranty. I think there are solutions there. So I think that that deserves at least some consideration.
Absolutely. This is a really good comment, Greg, and I appreciate it. And we definitely encourage you to provide those comments in a written format to us, so we can keep those, because I know we're just speaking, although we're recording it, but it would be helpful to have those comments in a written format to us, because those are the exact questions that we are looking from stakeholders. And if you have, I know some of your members may have the warranty information. It would be helpful to know the warranty rates for the equipment that are brand new and are leaking and were returned. I don't know if when they return an equipment to a retail store, whether the manufacturers get notified or how those things work. But if there are information on that, on how these equipments are getting returned, that will be helpful. The second thing is we also, on our discussion on Monday, you mentioned about the U.S. consumer reports, which reported about 1.7 million equipment were recalled between 2000 to 2013 as a result of leakages. It would be helpful, you mentioned that OPI had some responses to that. It would be helpful to also get those responses.
Yep, you're literally 1 second ahead of me. That's my next step here. I wanted to address the report from CPSC in 2015. So we did a significant analysis on that and worked with the agency, provided them feedback on our findings of the report, again contesting that the fuel tank leakage is not what that report suggests. And on July 11th, 2016, Mr. Han Lim, mechanical engineer who was working on the project, responded. He said, CPSC staff agrees with your assessment that the rate of reported stress cracks and seam splits from fuel tanks has decreased. Before the first edition of the standard, there were more recalls. After there were less. So I think generally before we made any revisions, after the report and we had dialogue with CPSC, again, in short, CPSC staff agrees with your assessment that the rate of reported stress cracks and seam splits from fuel tanks has decreased. Then we worked with them, with the agency, and through our standard development process to address several other concerns that have shown up in recalls, such as fuel filters, vent grommets, some other fuel system related things prior and even some in more recent years. And CPSC, of course, participated in that canvas body as well. And their response from Mr. Han Lim on October 12, 2017 was the list of proposed changes to the B71.10 standard is impressive and substantial. CPSC staff is confident that the addition of requirements for fuel filters, vent grommets, fuel shutoff valves, impact tests, ultraviolet light exposure, ozone exposure, and test sample conditioning to cold environments will reduce the likelihood of incidents and recalls associated with outdoor ground-supported gasoline fuel leaks. CPSC believes the proposed requirements will represent the fuel system components better as they're used in the field. So CPSC has been supportive. We've had a lot of dialogue with them. They participated in that process. We'll look to get you these letters probably as part of our comments package. But I wanted to make sure you received that update as we had talked about that a little bit on Monday. Any questions
great.
on that?
Thanks a lot, Greg.
Okay.
Sounds great. Thanks a lot. Greg, we also got another person who wants to talk. So just to be fair, do you mind? Maybe we can put you on hold for now, going to the other questions. And then if you have extra time, we can get back to your questions.
Yeah, I just have one more, and it has to do with that standard and some stuff that Christopher said. Can I take just 2 more minutes?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So I know Christopher had some questions about our 7110 standard, and they're looking into it. Again, this isn't finger pointing. Just a reminder, Christopher, we did invite CARB to participate in the canvas body. I guess I'm disappointed that for whatever reasons you had to decline to participate at that point. I think we could have worked maybe through some of these questions, and if you had some ideas for improvements at that time. So I guess we'll keep you on our list and encourage the agency to participate if it can in future revisions. Pull-off didn't change at all. Your question was with regard to handheld. Generally, we address handheld in a different standard. 7110 is largely focused and scoped towards ground-supported standards. But the B175 series of handheld standards that we develop, one for each product category, at least right now the way it's broken down, has fuel system specifications in the back of it, including accessibility to the different fuel lines in there. So if you want to look at those and have dialogue, happy to do that with you.
Thank you, Greg. We'll look at the individual standards, and thank you for clarifying on that. For the handheld engines. And I think it would be helpful to, have a discussion in the near future about the updates to the 7110 and the handheld standards.
Okay.
In terms of CARB's inability to participate in the canvas for that standard, it was determined by our executive management that it was not the proper place for us, considering the description of how our input might be or might not be incorporated into that standard. But we do look forward to discussing it with you and how it's been updated.
Okay. Well, our door is always open, and we're willing to hear suggestions, whether it's during a Canvas method or not. So that's how this process works. That's why it's successful. So our door is open. Thanks, Christopher.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Greg. I really appreciate your comments and your engagement in this whole process. I mean, as I mentioned multiple times, your input and your knowledge, and as well as your members, general OPI, is very valuable in getting us not only better information, but also better perspective on this specific category. Thank you. So with that, I will. There is one question from Hideharu Takimoto that I passed on to Walter Wong. So Walter, Hideharu is asking, is the leakage element in the model, or in other words, let me ask the question, maybe I can clarify a little bit. Is the leakage element in the model only in lawnmower or in some other equipment as well? In Offer 2007 model, it's really hard to identify it. And I think by leakage elements, I think Hideharu is referring to DR2, but Hideharu, correct me if I'm wrong with that. And maybe Walter, you can talk a little bit about which categories have this leakage component or DR2 in it.
Okay. If you look back in the model, the document from 2003, I think we listed riding mowers and chippers as surrogate for the lawn mowers data. So I think those two have DR2s.
Plus the lawnmower, so there are 3.
Yeah, but I could be wrong. I have to look at the 2003 memo to clarify.
Sounds great. Hideharu, let us know if that doesn't answer your question. Okay, so now we have Ryan Kosher who raised their hands. So Ryan, I'm going to unmute you. You're unmuted, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. I appreciate it. So this is Ryan Coker. I'm with MTD Products. Specifically, I'm on the handheld side. So I just want to make sure the comments that I'm providing here are really limited to that particular part of the industry. I know Greg touched on some of these points earlier with you as well about the DR in this revised model, but I did want to ask a couple of questions, maybe from a couple of angles. The first one on the DR, I know you guys talked a little bit about the assumptions in terms of malmaintenance, that sort of thing. But I guess, do you guys have any data either from in-service units or end-of-life units that supports some of the conclusion you have as far as engines reaching the standard limit by the end of life?
We have to look into that. I mean, this was the same question Greg asked about the data availability. At this point, there's a lack of data on that, and that's why we're just assuming that. I mean, this is probably our assumption is that as the equipment reaches their durability hours, which is different across different equipment categories, they hit the standard. This is just a way to model the impact of malmaintenance, but that's a really good question, and I think we're going to take a closer look at that. We're going to look at our history of the data collection we have in-house. We may also, I mean, I'm not sure how the lab is going to get back on, but we might also have the opportunity to do some further investigation into this and look into this. Jamie Banks also raised the question about sensitivity analysis. We can also do some sensitivity analysis on this to assess and evaluate the overall impact on the exhaust emission factors and as well as exhaust emissions as a result of these deterioration assumptions. that's a good point, and we can definitely get back to you on that.
Okay. So your response, I think, is question 14 on your Q&A that was sent out earlier in the week. You were talking about natural degradation of the engine versus malmaintenance, that sort of thing. And I guess just from my side, when we submit certifications, we give you both the certification level and the deterioration factor. And
right,
to me, that should absolutely cover that portion of that. And
exactly.
From my side, again, just handheld, we have relatively short lives compared to a lot of other equipment, but I have multiple families with DFs of 1 and also with relatively low certification levels. So if you tell me you're assuming my equipment is going to hit the standard, in some cases, you're assigning to me a DF of 2 or greater, which is quite a big leap from what we've certified. On top of that, and again, related to handheld.
So for handheld,
I'm sorry.
So are you talking about deterioration factors or deterioration rates for evap, or are you talking about exhaust?
Exhaust.
Okay. So yeah, we can definitely provide you with our assumptions on that, and also the durability hours, and let you know at what age we think they can hit the standard. Because as you mentioned, some of these handholds, they have pretty low usages.
Yeah, and then the final point that I wanted to make, and again, for handheld, is as far as maintenance is concerned, typically a lot of our recommended maintenance, and again, this is just from MTD, so I'm not trying to speak for anybody else, but what we typically recommend is the customer checks the spark plug about halfway through the life of the product, and that they occasionally clean the air filter, and that depends on usage and product type fairly heavily, but again, there's very, very little maintenance, if any, that's performed. And for our certification engines, I'm not aware of any test that's been performed since I've been with the company, which is several years now. So I've been there for all of our current certification tests. We have not replaced any components during that test. So the only degradation we're really seeing is with the catalyst, and that life, again, speaking to exhaust emissions, that life really would not change. So you're really only looking at maybe an air filter condition in certain equipment. If you're generating a lot of dust, perhaps you could see some effect there, but I would never expect it to say take a DF where I've certified to 1 and take it to a DF of 2 where I'd be hitting the standard as you guys assume. So I think it's definitely worth a review, and just want to make sure that you guys are accounting for that, particularly on handheld.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Ryan. I really appreciate it. And if you also have other information that you can provide us, the type of information you were talking about as part of your comment letter, that would be really helpful, because that can definitely help us with what adjustments we need to make.
Okay. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. Okay. All right. We don't have any other questions. Well, we just got one. So, Hideharu, Hideharu mentioned that answered my questions, and Greg Knott mentioned we should look at the input files for those DR1, DR2. I hope those input files will be provided to you fairly soon.
Sam, the email just came through.
Okay, so Greg, it sounds like the email has been sent out. Please let us know if you haven't received it, and we can definitely follow up. So Masaru Yamamoto, which part of the current DBL test procedure will propose to be changed for reducing more evaporative emissions in the real world? If CARB already have an idea, can CARB share those ideas before the next workshop in May? So Christopher, I'm going to assign this question to you. maybe you can help answering that.
Yeah, just to be clear, this webinar, last week's webinar, are discussing the inventory model. It happens that the rulemaking group is also on here. I think this question has more to do with the rulemaking, and so I'm happy to answer it. Just wanted to clarify. So in terms of the diurnal test, he's asking which part we might propose to change. So as we discussed in our September 2019 workshop, we're looking at reducing standards for diurnal and hot soak emissions versus where they are today. There is a diurnal emission standard for non-handheld engines greater than 80 cc's. Hot soak emissions are measured for those engines, but there's no standard currently. And there are no diurnal or hot soak emission standards for handheld engines at or below 80 cc's. We're looking at setting hot soak plus diurnal emission standards for all of the engines, regardless of size. That would be reduced from where the current standards are today. Does that answer the question?
Thanks, Christopher. Yeah, so Masara just replied, thanks very much for the answer. The question is answered. Greg Knott has another question. How's the rulemaking staff using this model to evaluate needed emission reductions and as a result to develop the new rule? Christopher, do you want to answer that, or do you want us to take care of it?
So I can address that. We are going to be looking at scenarios using the model to look at how reducing standards could potentially achieve emission reductions. We have not done that analysis as of yet.
There's a question from Angel Fong on slide 28, and slide 28 is the slide which is showing the proposed evaporative emission factors. She's asking what pollutant was measured for proposed evaporative emission factors. Christopher, do you want to answer that? So as part of our eval testing, what pollutants were measured?
Okay, so the diurnal emission test uses a flame ionization detector that measures hydrocarbons and other organic gases. It can measure things like ethanol, which are also in gasoline. However, a lot of the testing represented here used gasoline that did not contain ethanol because that was the required certification and testing fuel at the time. So these emissions could be described as various ways. Hydrocarbons or reactive organic gases is the term we use for assessing air quality impacts, ozone formation. but strictly speaking, typically the measurement was just hydrocarbons.
Thanks, Christopher. We have no more questions. Can give it another couple more minutes. If we don't get any questions, then we can adjourn the webinar. I'll just wait till, right now it's 11:13. I'll wait till 11:15. Let us know if you have any questions. Again, we can, as we mentioned, we are still open for your questions that you can send us through emails. Also, send us your comments by April 24th so we can consider them as part of the, as we are finalizing the model. And this slide provides the contact information for Walter Wong, our lead inventory staff, Dorothy Fibiger, our lead regulatory staff, David Chubb, manager of the inventory section, Christopher Dilbeck, manager over the regulatory section, and my contact information, which I'm overseeing the inventory development. All right, so we received two questions, one comment and one question. Jamie Banks mentioned, thank you for all your work. Thanks, Jamie. And Angel Fong is asking a question about survival curve. So maybe I can take that, and Angel, and Walter, you can chime in. So survival curves are a component in inventory which are used to estimate as the equipments are sold or as new, how many of them get scrapped or leave the fleet over time. So, for example, assume if you have 100 equipment that are sold as new or bought by consumers as at age 0, meaning like they're brand new. The survival curve is a curve or is percentages that determine how many of these equipment will remain in the fleet over years. One of the things with the small off-road engine, as it appears on one of the slides we're showing about survival curve, is that typically you should expect survival curves to go like to be at 100%, then going down, because as people are using those equipment, they're getting scrapped. For example, if you look at survival curve for cars, there are, for example, 2 million cars sold in California of a certain model year, and 10 years after that, of those 2 million, maybe only 5 million of them, maybe only 500,000 of them remain in the fleet, because the rest of them are either scrapped or sold out of state, etc. So with small off-road engines, some of the other categories, because not all of that specific model year is sold at retail store in that year. What we have seen in our survey data is that while age 0 is at 100, but then those previous model year equipment are still sold in the retail stores, so people can buy them over a couple of years until they're fully sold, and then we start seeing that decreasing trend. That's why you see an increase in the survival curve and then a decrease. That means, for example, if 100 model year 2018 equipment is sold in 2020, you may find 150 of them in the fleet in use. And then after 10 years, you may only find 10 of them. So that's the survival curve definition. Hopefully that answered your question. If not, you can definitely email us and we can provide you with more written response. Patrick Len Hockey is asking, has the staff considered if it is statistically representative to straight average test and sort data to determine zero-hour factors? Does that disproportionately bias the factors to the samples tested and away from the distribution of the entire population? That's a good question, Patrick. We can definitely look into that and give you a clear response. I have to mention that the equipment that were tested was randomly selected, and as we were discussing this over with Greg when he was providing his comments, one of the critical aspects of inventory is real-world emissions. So these equipments, because there were equipments that were procured in use and are not just from the certification test, we believe they are reflective of in-use emissions, but we do agree the sample size are different across different equipments, and we can definitely look into the statistically significance of and representativeness of straight average versus other methods. But that's a good question, and we're going to definitely look into that. We don't have any other questions yet. Again, if you have any other questions that are not addressed in this webinar, right now we don't have anything on our question log. Please reach out to us on the emails provided on slide 4, and we can definitely get back to you as soon as we can. With that, I don't have any other questions. The panelists, do you guys have any other comments, or is there any questions that, or is there any comments you want to provide, or anything that you want to add?
I think on the 2DR, this is Walter. I think it was a riding mower, chipper, wood splitters, and others, lawn and garden. There's like 4 of them.
Okay. Thanks, Walter.
Okay.
Again, going back to one of the questions, if you need the input files as well as the output data from the model, please reach out to us, and we can definitely get that to you as soon as we can. Those are readily available, have been reviewed, and they can be submitted. But please note that the model and the outputs and input files are still preliminary. As you noted, we're still fine-tuning the assumptions, as well as looking into the comments and data that we're going to receive during the comment period in terms of different aspects of the model, emission factors, activity, deterioration rates, load factor, etc. We'll look into all of the information, and we'll adjust the model accordingly. Okay, we don't have any other questions. Again, thank you very much for attending this webinar. I again apologize for the technical difficulties that happened last week with the March 25th workshop. And luckily, we didn't experience any of that today. But please reach out to us. We are open to meet with you and discuss different questions. We definitely encourage you to send us data along with your comments, supporting data in terms of both emissions, activity, and population. And we definitely consider those as we're finalizing the inventory model. With that, thank you guys, and stay safe and healthy, and looking forward to your comments. Thank you.